Okay, we are online now. We can start.
Okay, and it's going to be no problem for Bill to come in, right? So we'll just hope he shows
I'm
up.
I'm I'm here. I'm here.
Oh, Bill, wonderful, thank you.
Sorry.
So yeah, Luis, anytime. Just
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
yeah,
We're
go ahead.
live.
We're ready to go.
Yeah, we're ready.
Oh, hello everyone. Excuse us for the confusion here. Good evening. My name is Ted Lewis. I'm the co-executive director of Global Exchange. Thank you for joining us for this presentation on the illegal Trump-Bukele prison pipeline to El Salvador, a threat to all. Before we get started, I want to let everyone know that this event includes Spanish-English interpretation. So to listen to the entire event in English, just listen. The original is in English. Buen día, este evento cuenta con interpretación español-inglés. Para escuchar todo el evento en español, seleccione el botón de interpretación en la parte inferior de la pantalla, el botón con el globo. En tu celular selecciones el botón más y luego interpretación. So let's get going. In recent days, the case of Kilmar Abrego García, the Maryland father who was mistakenly seized and deported to the notorious CECOT prison in El Salvador, has cast a spotlight on President Trump's dangerous and unprecedented violations of due process rights. Judge J. Harvey Wilkinson III, a conservative Reagan appointee who sits on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit, recently ruled on the case. His opinion condemned the administration's arrogant and heartless behavior in terms that echo far beyond his bench. This behavior by the Trump administration, he says, should be shocking, not only to judges, but to the intuitive sense of liberty that Americans far removed from the courthouses still hold dear. What we face here is not a right versus left or Republican versus Democrat issue. It is a matter of democracy versus dictatorship. Due process is what stands between us and lawlessness and political repression by any administration, and in this case, one openly committed to seizing illegitimate power. Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland traveled to El Salvador last week on Abrego Garcia's behalf. He concluded his post-trip remarks with a reminder that this is an issue for every American, and I might add for everyone who lives in this hemisphere in the Americas, to dig into what is happening and why, and what people are doing to oppose this extrajudicial dark alliance between Trump and self-styled world's coolest dictator, Nayib Bukele. We have invited some real experts. But before we introduce our guests, I want to remind folks that we need your questions. We want your questions. In the second half of the program, we'll try to answer as many of them as we can. So please, wherever you're watching, whether it be on YouTube, Facebook, Rompiviento TV, or here on Zoom, put your questions in the chat and we'll get to as many of them as we possibly can. We are very pleased to have with us tonight three experts. First, Neil Bullock, Executive Director of the highly respected independent human rights organization, Cristo Sal. Welcome, Noah. We also are fortunate to have Gabriela Santos, who's the director of the critically important Human Rights Institute of the Jose Simeon Cañas Central American University, known as the UCA, El Salvador's Jesuit University. And to start us off, Bill Ong Hing, professor of law and migration studies at the University of San Francisco. He directs the USF Immigration and Deportation Defense Clinic, and he founded the Immigrant Legal Resource Center in 1979 and has been a leading advocate for immigrant rights ever since. Bill, thank you very much. Let's start with the United States. First, a look at the Kilmar Abrego Garcia case and its immediate ramifications in the U.S. Can you take a few minutes to talk about his case and the way it has been handled by the Trump administration, and perhaps answer the questions: are we in a constitutional crisis or something worse? And what is the Alien Enemies Act of 1798? And what does its use pretend for both Abrego Garcia, for our legal system, and for that matter, the due process rights of everyone in the United States?
Thank you for the invitation, Ted, and I'm so honored to be here with your other guests, Gabriela and Noah, who are at the forefront of these battles. First of all, let me state something boldly at the beginning. Yes, I think the United States is definitely in a challenging situation. That some people already would think we're in a constitutional crisis because we have a maverick president who doesn't believe that anyone can tell him what to do, including the courts. But my bold prediction is that Mr. Abrego Garcia will be brought back to the United States, and that he will see his family again, and hopefully, I think that's going to be within the next short period of time, and by that I mean within the next month, I hope. So, the Alien Enemies Act is a theory that the Trump administration came up with, that where they claim that if we're at war with another country, that they can do whatever they want to people who are from that country that we're at war with. And everyone should be scratching their head at this point, because when were we at war with Venezuela or El Salvador? Okay. Well, there's not a declared war. And I'll explain to you why I'm referring to whether or not there's a war with El Salvador in a minute. But the theory that Mr. Trump is using with respect to Venezuela is that the president of Venezuela, Maduro, is sending gang members, Tren de Aragua, to the United States, and that he's the one who is licensing them to come here, and that's an act of war. And that's his justification for rounding up alleged gang members. And incidentally, there's no proof that anyone that was sent to El Salvador from Venezuela was a gang member. So that's a big question, and it's important that people realize that the Supreme Court, it's true, the Supreme Court saw a version of this case a few weeks ago, the JJG case, the letters JJG, and in that decision, the Supreme Court said, well, before you can deport anyone under the Alien Enemies Act, they have a right to a hearing. It's an unusual hearing, but it's something called habeas corpus, not a regular deportation hearing. But they at least have a right to a habeas corpus hearing. And so 9 judges said that. 9 judges said that. Even Clarence Thomas and Alito said that they went along with that a couple of weeks ago, that they at least have a right to a hearing. And so the problem is that that to me, ultimately, all 200 of those Venezuelans that were sent to El Salvador, they should all 200 be brought back because they never had a hearing. Okay, and so the media is not talking much about that. Now, Abrego Garcia, he was different. He's from El Salvador, and a few years ago, before the pandemic, he had a deportation hearing. And at that deportation hearing, he applied for asylum. But there was evidence that he had engaged in criminal action before he came to the United States. And because of that, he didn't get asylum. He got something else. He got something called withholding of removal. And withholding, again, it's odd because most people who are listening probably are not familiar with it, but it is an epitome of our international obligations to not deport somebody who has fear of being persecuted in the country that they're being sent to. And he was granted that by a judge. And what's interesting is that when they arrested him and sent him, they admitted after he was sent to the CEPOC, the prison in El Salvador, they admitted that it was an administrative mistake, that he shouldn't have been removed. Now, it's true that Vice President Vance and other people are saying that that we should deport him anyway, even if he comes back. But what the lower court judge said, and Judge Wilkinson said very, very sharply, and it's not a long decision, it's a 7-page decision that people should read. The Supreme Court said in Abrego Garcia's case that the Trump administration should facilitate his return. 9 judges said that. Again, a different case. 9 judges said that Abrego Garcia should be, his return should be facilitated. And so the government is arguing, what does facilitate mean? It's vague. Well, Judge Wilkinson said, as Ted pointed out, facilitate does not mean you do nothing. Okay, he said that very clearly. It doesn't mean that you can not do nothing. You have to do something. Show us you're making phone calls, showing you're making efforts. And it was very offensive last week when President Bukele and President Trump were sitting together in the White House, and Bukele was mocking for a second time, mocking Mr. Abrego Garcia, saying, "Oh, I can't bring a terrorist back here," kind of thing. And of course, that's ridiculous, because if he just asked President Trump, "Do you want him back?" and if President Trump said yes, he would be back within a few hours. And so that's why here's where we're going to run into a constitutional crisis. This case is going to get back to the Supreme Court, and I think the next time, at least 6 or 7 of the judges are going to be clear. They're going to say facilitate means bring him back. Show us all the efforts that you're making to bring him back. And if they show 0 efforts and they do nothing, that's when, if they do nothing, that's when we're in deep trouble. And only Congress can get us out of this by impeachment. And I don't know if Congress is going to do that. And so that's why I think that the Trump administration is going to bring him back. I think they're going to be ordered by 7 of the judges to bring him back soon, within the next month. And I think we're going to see him back.
You think we're going to see him back, and that could avert the direct conflict between the Supreme Court and the administration, at least in the short run?
I do. And I think it's because other members of Congress, Republican members of Congress, are going to tell Trump, you know what, you got to bring this guy back. He should be afforded a minimum amount of due process. You did not give him a hearing when you put him on that airplane, and you said you made a mistake. Bring him back. I think some Republicans are going to say that to him.
Okay, well, thanks, Bill. We're going to get back to that, and I can already see a lot of questions coming in through our channels that we're going to hit you with later. So thank you very much for that. And Gabriela Santos, let's turn to El Salvador. We want to know about the prison system in El Salvador and how it operates, and why U.S. President Trump is forging this patently unconstitutional alliance with a foreign leader. But first, can you please tell us about who Nayib Bukele is and how he came to power? I think a lot of our listeners in the United States are not familiar with his history. Could you, briefly give us a little history on him and the path that led to the state of exception that the country is living in today? Gabi, I think you're on mute. Try again.
We're still unable to hear.
I can't hear you. I'm sorry for the technical difficulty. Noah, can you hear Gabriela?
No, I can't. I wonder if she's on a different channel. Maybe she's on the English or Spanish channel. I don't know.
I just checked. I'm not hearing her at all.
Yeah, I don't hear her either.
Let's see. While you're figuring that out, Gabi, can we'll go to Noah. This isn't the order that I had intended, but Noah, as the longtime director of Cristo Sal, you've watched the evolution of U.S. policy in Central America during multiple administrations. How would you characterize the policy shift in recent months as we have moved from the
Hi, can you hear
Biden-Harris
me?
to the new? Are you back, Gabi?
Yes, I'm back.
Oh, perfect. Okay, well, hold that question, Noah. Go
Okay.
ahead,
Oh,
please.
okay, great. Thank you, Ted. Hello, everyone. It's really nice to be here. I'm also honored to be sharing this space with you. Well, you have made such difficult questions, but I'm going to try to answer them briefly. So Bukele won the constitutional presidential election on 2019. And after that, his party won the majority of the Congress on 2021. And then when they got, the first day that they were in Congress, they removed all the Supreme Court's judges and also the Attorney General, and they replaced them with people that were loyal to the president. So what we have now is that all the three branches are concentrated. Just all the power from the state in El Salvador is concentrated in one person or in one circle. And that's when we have this the control of everything, from the president, also the judicial system, and also all the Congress. So that is a really big problem now because President Bukele controls all the state institutions. There is no independence of power here in El Salvador. We don't have any public information either. So we have now this kind of he controls everything, and we really need to have in mind that any abuse of power is really dangerous. And what we're seeing now, I mean, he dismantled what was left from our democratic system. We have now this state of exception that we have been, having for 3 years now. And all the policies that have been happening, we cannot understand them without all this concentration of power. I mean, we cannot understand and we cannot separate the state of exception without having in mind what has happened prior to that. And it's all this concentration of power, the lack of checks and balances, and also we have no guarantees at all here. President Bukele, through the Congress, declared the state of emergency in 2022, and this suspended all the normal due process rights and ordered mass arrests, and we have now for all these 3 years. And it's like, I deeply regret that in the United States, people are experiencing what we have been experiencing or enduring in El Salvador for years now: the disrespect for the rule of law, the disrespect of due process, all the procedural guarantees, and just a disregard for democratic principles and human rights. And the case of Kilmar is an example of this arbitrariness, the disregard of the principle of legality, all the legal fragility that we are living through in El Salvador, and also that you're experiencing now. And also all the families, mostly Venezuelan families, have been enduring now all this lack of information, all these negative responses, and just not the will to solve all the big problems that we need to be solved. What is happening inside the prisons, we don't know them for sure, but we have kind of two sources. One is the testimony of the people that have been released. It's the only way that we know because, for example, the Iduca or Cristosal, we cannot go into the prisons. So here is important to make a disclaimer that the people that have been released are not considered innocent. They just continue in the process with, they have been given other measures beside prison, but the process is still going. And we know for the testimonies that systematic torture has been made inside the prisons. And also we have, people that have been murdered inside the prisons. So we just know that from the testimonies. And what is happening in these prisons are the ones that we never see on TV, because the conditions that are in these other prisons are even more inhumane than CECOT. What is happening here is not legal, it's not constitutional, and it's a violation of human rights in general. The other source that we have to know what has happened inside the prisons is what the Salvadorian government let us see. And this is mostly what all these images and videos from CECOT that we kind of, are more familiar with, from what we see from YouTubers, influencers, and other media that have been allowed into CECOT, but we don't know what is the state of the prison for sure. Because also all the media has like the same tour, and that's what even Senator Van Hollen said, that he didn't want a tour. He wanted to speak and see Kilmar, but that's what the government offers. They kind of give these tours and try to picture all these gang members and tattooed people, and saying this narrative that they are, just terrorists that needs to be in prison. And the thing is that we know for sure that there are thousands of innocent people that have no links with gangs that are inside the prison without the respect of any due process or human rights in general. I can keep going, but I don't want to take much time and give a space, to further questions. So I don't know if I
Yeah, well, thank
space
you,
for more.
Gabriela. I wanted to make sure we talk about what the implications are of the use of CECOT by the Trump administration. Could you just give that a moment's attention before we move to Noah?
Okay, well, what we have here is, all the rule of law, and I really want to emphasize that. I mean, there is no law, or um, eh, there's no foundation on what is happening here. Because at least in the US, you have this Aliens Enemies Act, but here we don't have anything. There is no, everything is unconstitutional. There is no law in which everything that has been done is based. Also, we don't know the agreement between the US and El Salvador. We don't have any access to public information, so we don't know what the agreement is about. So for, here in El Salvador, for the past 3 years, we um, it doesn't matter if people that have been detained have links to, gang members. It doesn't matter if we can prove that they have no connection to gangs. It just doesn't matter because, they keep people in prison because they can and because they want to. And that's what we're seeing now. I mean, all these migrants have been kind of, they have taken into CECOT, but we don't know for sure if they have any links, for example, to Tren de Aragua or anything. And so this is really dangerous. I mean, because this is not based on anything, like the respect of the rule of law, the separation of powers, etc. This is not based on democratic principles, and we don't know until how long or um, what are other implications are going to be here. At least in the United States, you still have judges and courts that defend democracy and fight to contain what is happening. You still have Congress people, senators who continue to push back. But sadly, here in El Salvador, all power is concentrated. And I'm going to emphasize this again because this is at the basis of everything. So we know also that the Trump administration has been lying about, for example, Mr. Abrego and other people in general, just as Bukele administration has done with thousands of innocent people who are not terrorists and they're not gang members. And all the consequences of these arbitrary decisions made by two men, just one more powerful than the other, are devastating. If this is going to keep going, that I mean, we don't know for sure, but we have this man that acts in a populist way without respecting any rule of law, that is having the validation of another president that has way more power than this one. So what is happening here is really dangerous, and also how this narrative is being constructed. For example, saying that if you say we need that the rules of law needs to be respected, you are stigmatized and criticized and portrayed as criminal, that you kind of defend criminals. So that's what we have been facing all these years, and now we're seeing that even against senators. So this is really, a big issue, and this is so unfortunate that we're living this, everything that is happening here in El Salvador, that we are now seeing this because, Bukele's model is considered as a model, as a successful model, and this is based on the repression and violation of human rights and the rule of law.
Thank you. That's very heavy, Gabi. And thank you so much for that description. Noah, we are, really wanting to understand more this alliance between the Bukele administration and the Trump administration. And you've watched the evolution of U.S. policy in Central America during multiple U.S. administrations. How would you characterize the policy shift in recent months between the Biden-Harris and the new Trump-Vance administrations? Noah, you're on mute.
Hopefully you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Very good. Thank you, Ted, for including me, and good to be here with Bill and Gabby. I think, with the Biden administration, especially in the early part, the Biden administration wanted to frame their partnerships in Central America around the goals of countering corruption, strengthening democracy, and sort of economic progress, prosperity. And in the early phases, when Nayib and his party were doing the things that Gabby outlined, using the military to threaten to dissolve the Congress, using supermajorities to overthrow the courts and the Attorney General, the Biden administration used some of the tools in their toolbox to sanction people, members of the Salvadoran government, for anti-democratic actions. And then later, there were Treasury Department investigations that implicated members of the president's party in acts of corruption, and also placed sanctions on them. And then probably more notably, we've learned more about a Justice Department investigation that began actually in the first Trump administration with the creation of a task force that they called the Volcan Task Force. And they were charged for investigating the activities of the Mara Salvatrucha, the transnational activities of the principal gang of El Salvador, the Mara Salvatrucha. And in 2023, the Justice Department released their indictment or their accusation against 14 members or leadership of the Mara Salvatrucha. And in that indictment, they outline how the gang was able to use violence and exercise political influence. It's part of the terrorism charges that the Justice Department was trying to investigate against these individuals. And it's very clear in the indictment that the president and his government had a deep relationship with the gang leadership, especially in the first 3 years of his administration. And he was able to, through that partnership, create the perception of improved security conditions, where the Justice Department notes that the gangs still gave orders to carry out killings, but that the methodology would be to hide the bodies, to disappear the bodies. And Gabby, you will remember that in that period of time, there were these organizations of families of disappeared people that would be asking the government to search for their family members, and the government would act almost accusing them, the parents, of not having taken care of their children and for leading them down the bad paths and really being very hostile towards family members of disappeared people. But I mention all that because, in short, the Biden administration tried to establish certain standards in the beginning. They shifted a bit towards seeking a more constructive partnership, but the State Department in their human rights reports implicated the Salvadoran government in human rights violations. The Justice Department in their investigations implicated the Bukele government in illicit partnerships and negotiations with the gangs in exchange for political benefits. And the Treasury Department implicated members of his government in corruption. So in short, the impression one gets of the President Bukele's regime is an anti-democratic, corrupt, and human rights violating regime, which is now very different because we see members of the Trump administration celebrating the partnership that they have with the Bukele government, specifically in dealing with combating gangs and organized crime. So there's kind of this irreconcilable contradiction in that there are still ongoing investigations and prosecutions against the gangs that implicate the Bukele administration in partnership with them, while the State Department currently in the Trump administration celebrates the Bukele regime as their key partner in combating those very groups.
I want to let folks know that we put an article into the chat, a link to an article in the New Yorker. It's a very, very good and detailed article in which Noah was quoted extensively talking about this exact same subject. Noah, how would you, if you could just characterize in a few words the Trump-Bukele alliance, what would you say about it?
Yeah, I think there's an alliance of convenience in that President Bukele has captured all the state institutions. He has eliminated rule of law and imposed the rule of one man. And that has allowed him to offer special services to the Trump administration, which is the service of a prison system that operates outside of the rule of law, outside of due process, and in which they have committed systematic and mass human rights abuses. So that partnership is useful when you want to be able to do things outside of the rule of law. For example, President Bush rendered people to Guantanamo Bay, George W. Bush. But those populations of people were still subjected to courts and due process, whereas the people who are now being rendered to the terrorist confinement center in El Salvador won't even have that protection in place. So that's, I think, a sort of a convenience in pursuing a policy of terror against migrant populations. And in this relationship, President Bukele, ironically being a president of a country of migrants, becomes kind of the executioner and coercive threat in a policy of terror against migrants in the United States. But I also think they have a deeper alignment. They're two people who see themselves as disruptors of a rules-based international order. There are two people who consider that human rights and democracy norms are checks on their powers, and therefore they are obstacles that should be overcome. And so I think that they have a political alignment in that sense, the way that they envision themselves exercising power without limits in their own countries, but also they have a vision of a world, or share a vision of a world in which international human rights law or standards, multilateral institutions that would check or limit power should be dismantled or weakened.
Thank you for that, Noah. And we'd like to move on to the next section to talk about what can people do, how can people mobilize to push back on what is happening. I'd like to read a couple of comments and questions that have come in prior to going to that. One is from Estefania Salazar from Caracas, Venezuela. She says, "Thank you for this space. I'm worried about my fellow 238 countrymen already deported to CECOT with no due process and seemingly no way out, and unanswered habeas corpus by the Salvador Supreme Court. Could we, Venezuela, El Salvador, U.S., concerned citizen, human rights organizations, and others enhance possible collaboration initiatives to help them further? Their relatives in Venezuela say they know nothing about them." Other questions: what is the status of Mr. Garcia? Some doubt that his safe return. So, Bill Hing, what are the things that people are doing in the United States to push back, and what do you think are the things that folks who are listening to this call and should be doing, asking of our representatives? Where do we go from here?
Well, several things. One, of course, there have been many, many lawsuits. I think over 100 lawsuits filed challenging Trump actions, and most of those relate to immigration. And there's two specifically that affect Mr. Abrego Garcia. One specifically, and then the general one attacking the use of the Alien Enemies Act. And again, the Supreme Court has not ruled on whether or not the Alien Enemies Act is appropriate. They're leaving that for the lower courts to determine. They specifically said, we're not addressing that issue yet. We're just saying that people deserve a right to a hearing. So the lawsuits are good. Every weekend in the United States and across the country, there have been mass protests, and I haven't seen anything like that for some time. Hopefully it carries on. It's been going on now for whatever, 4 weekends. And here's the challenge, that when you see the protesters, now the protesters they happen all over, even in conservative states in the United States. Most of the protesters are not protesting about immigration. Most of the protesters are protesting things like tariffs, or people being laid off, or the cutback in funding for education. Very, very important things. And the polls show that many of Trump's supporters are upset about those types of things. I worry about not seeing, except in San Francisco and San Jose, not seeing that many protesters who are protesting immigration policies in other parts of the United States. And I think that we need to make sure that our members of Congress, beginning with our Democratic members, because I'm very disappointed that most Democrats are not talking about immigration either. Just a handful of them are complaining. And so, yeah, we actually have to get to the Republicans to talk more about immigrant rights. But the Democrats should be the strong voice on immigration issues. And I know there's plenty to complain about with Trump, but I want we need to push we need to ourselves get out on the streets and make our voices known, but we also need to get our leaders, our democratic leaders, to get out and do things. Many of your listeners know Bernie Sanders and Alejandro AOC, Ocasio-Cortez, and they've been going out and drawing big crowds, but they talk very little about immigration, actually. And so we have to put pressure on that to occur. But again, to the first part of the question, I'm repeating, his condition, Mr. Abrego Garcia's condition, as far as we can see, and as far as what Senator Van Hollen said, that he was okay. And I mean, obviously he's been in prison, and he was moved around a lot, but he so far he hasn't been tortured. Some people were expecting that he was dead already, and so it was good that we saw him alive and having a conversation with the senator. And that's why I just maybe it's hopeful thinking on my part, but I believe he's going to be returned.
All right, thank you, Bill. I really appreciate that, and I wanted to mention that I believe 4 members of the U.S. Congress were in El Salvador today: Yasmin Amari, Maxine Dexter, Maxwell Frost, and Robert Garcia. So I'm hoping that represents some movement on from the liberal end of the Democratic Party. Noah, you mentioned in the chat that you have been in touch with Venezuelan families and that you could respond to Estefania's question. Could you please go ahead?
Yeah, and thanks for the question, Estefania. We were contacted right after the deportation flight arrived by Venezuelan families and Venezuelan organizations in exile. And what we did is we opened up a platform. I'll put the link to it in the chat for Venezuelan families to be able to register their cases and give us consent to present habeas corpus claims on their behalf in El Salvador. So as of last Friday, we had 138 families who had registered their cases with us, and we are working our way through each one of those and developing individual habeas corpus claims based on the conditions of each case. I mentioned that just because it's one of the options that we have still. It's symbolic. The right to habeas corpus in El Salvador has been all but stripped by the Supreme Court under the state of exception over, I don't know that we said this data point yet, Ted, but in the last 3 years, the Salvadoran government has detained 85,000 people without previous investigations, without warrant, and they have been imprisoned, as Gabby said, without due process, and many of them subjected to torture that has produced hundreds of deaths, at least that we've been able to document as an organization. And in that context, Salvadoran families of people detained in the state of exception have presented 7,200 habeas corpus claims to the court, and less than 1% of them have been admitted. About eight cases, I think. So I say that not to discourage anyone, but one of the things that we have to do strategically is to exhaust the national jurisdictions here in El Salvador, to demonstrate that the courts lack the independence to intervene and protect rights, and then scale up and activate international justice, and use our advocacy and our litigation here in El Salvador to support the litigation that Bill has been talking about in the U.S. to demonstrate that the people here are in a judicial black hole, and there's no jurisdiction here that can intervene to protect them. We also are going to have a meeting this week with members with different Venezuelan families and give them additional legal advising and try and encourage them to join in solidarity with Salvadoran families who have organized during the state of exception. The Salvadoran families of innocent people detained have been doing a campaign right now called the Letters of Hope, where they write letters to their family members knowing that they'll never get them, but they send them to different members of Congress, to different public officials. And we want to invite the Venezuelans to join the families of Salvadoran innocent victims of the regime in that campaign. And just, I'll close with this. There was a protest outside of the Mariona prison 2 weeks ago by an organization of families of victims of the regime. And they, as always, were asking for or demanding the freedom of their loved ones, but also the freedom for the Venezuelans unjustly rendered to the terrorist confinement center.
Thank you, Gabi. That's great, Noah. So important. Gabi, people have been asking in the chat why or if the way that Kilmar Abrego Garcia has been treated has had any effect on public opinion in El Salvador. Has that changed people's views on what is happening, or has it not really had any impact?
Well, here in El Salvador, I guess it's too soon to say that this has had an impact, because we have been experiencing this for more than 3 years now. I mean, innocent people that have been detained. So this is another case that just adds up to what has been happening here. It's really unfortunate, but also, we have families which have loved ones that have been detained and still support President Bukele. I think what is happening here is everything is like maybe like all these reactions are bad for the American people, people from the United States or Venezuelan families that are now frustrated because they don't know the conditions that their relatives are in the prisons. They don't know when they are going to see their relatives for sure. Just as all these families here in El Salvador have been experiencing this for all these years. So I also have to say that, President Bukele is really popular. He's a populist. And unfortunately, also, these populist measures have a big impact on people because, if this all this narrative keeps telling you that these are terrorists, that these are gang members, that these people murdered a lot of families, so you want them to be in prison. And that's what the government keeps telling us. So you won't say, oh, that's so this is bad, what is happening, this is not fair, this has nothing to do with justice. You don't say that because you are going to agree with them that this is the only way to be safe. And that's a problem because for all these years we have been listening to this speech that in order to have security or in order to be safe, you kind of have to give your human rights. And so now people, they just don't care what they have to give in return because, they want to be safe. And for sure, I mean, there is nothing against safety and security, and we have been saying this for a lot of time. I mean, of course we need to be safe, of course we want peace. I mean, who doesn't want that? But we insist that this is not the way. I mean, what President Bukele has done is not a model to be replicated. This is dangerous, and it is most dangerous that this has the backing of a powerful nation right now. So, yes, I mean, I think it's too soon maybe to say that people, are really angry or sad about what is happening. But of course, for other people that have not been experiencing this for such a long time, we and for what you asked before, we don't have to normalize this, even though we have been, enduring this for all this time. We don't have to think this is normal, to think that the disrespect of the rule of law is normal, that, the fact that we don't have any guarantees or there is no due process, this is not normal. And we have to keep pushing and saying that, we want security, we want safety, we want peace, but you will also want the respect of basic human rights and due process.
We have a couple more questions and just a couple more minutes. The one question comes in here. It's just really grateful for your insights and your ongoing labor on these issues. Is there something that can disrupt the partnership between Bukele's authoritarian regime and Trump's? For example, what would help interrupt the likelihood that Bukele leases Salvadoran territory to the U.S. and undermines the critique of unduly processed deportations outside the U.S. if part of Salvador is considered leased to the United States? I don't know much about that issue. Is that something that you have come across, Gabi? Or
No,
or Noah?
I think Noah, yes. Noah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's correct to say that President Trump has subcontracted services from President Bukele and the Salvadoran government, and the services to detain indefinitely people with no due process, right? But it's not the same thing as leasing. The Trump administration is not leasing a part of the Salvadoran territory. There was that soundbite in which Trump basically asked Bukele to build more prisons so he could send potentially homegrown criminals, he said. And Bukele answered by saying, "I have plenty of space." The CECOT is built on the terrorist confinement center is built on a large plot of land. And they I think have the projection of continuing to build out the mega prison. But the bigger question is, like, what could disrupt the partnership? I sometimes I think that when you have regimes like the ones that we're dealing with, like Bukele and with Trump, they are resistant to checks and balances and to the normal controls, or even sometimes the normal political pressures, because especially in the case of President Bukele, I think it's doubtful that even elections could serve to create political change. And in that context, and especially from the perspective of the victims of the regime, the only way to move it is through organizing, through solidarity and mutual support. That's what victims in El Salvador have done to survive and continue to advocate. And I think that's why we should be doing these calls, is that we are not in a conflict between nations right now, but in terms of visions of the world. Will this be a world in which the powerful do what they like and the weak do what they must, or will this be a world governed by laws?
Can I jump in here, Ted?
Please.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Noah just said. And Ted, I think I'm going to credit you with what I'm about to say, because I think that you told me this. If not, you should just accept the compliment anyway.
Okay.
This is an opportunity for the rest of the world to realize what Bukele is doing. And as Gabriela said, he's been doing this since the state of exception went into effect, more than 2 years ago. And some of us knew what was going on, but I don't think the rest of the world was focused on this. And this is an opportunity for the international community to find out what the hell's going on there, and try to bust that wide open. Because and as Noah and Gabriela and Ted, I mean, he bent the rules, right, to become president again. And I just think that we ought to take advantage of this opportunity to just focus the heck out of this human rights abuse, and the fact that Trump is trying to emulate him, right? And Trump is happy to ship off U.S. citizens there, and forget about U.S. citizens as well. And I want to be able to say that this is backfiring, that this will backfire on them, against both of them.
Well, thank you, Bill. And I think it's our job to make sure that it does backfire. I hope that everyone listening tonight will join us in that. And before we're getting close to the hour here, I want to thank everybody. But before we wrap up, I want to take just a moment to tell you about Global Exchange, the nonprofit organization hosting tonight's event. Global Exchange is an international human rights organization that's been advancing social, economic, and environmental justice since 1988. And at a time when democracy and due process are under attack, we all understand the need to build movements that connect and empower local communities in the global struggle for change. So if you've appreciated tonight's webcast, I invite you to please join us. You can learn more and make donations at globalexchange.org. Every contribution helps power the fight for justice. And before we end, I want to say thank you so much to Noah Bullock, Gabriela Santos, and Bill Hing. We will no doubt be reaching out to you to further this subject. There were many questions that came in tonight that we didn't get to, but we are going to do that. And we also want to thank our interpreters and Rompeviento Television, who was behind the scenes here tonight, making this broadcast possible. Thank you again, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you.